BlomCast. Turning Points in History. Wendepunkte in der Geschichte. Welcome to the BlomCast, the podcast that looks at turning points in history. And today I'm really excited and privileged to have an old friend joining me, the distinguished teacher and distinguished philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah, author of many books that simply speak more loudly, Anthony, as time goes by. And I want to structure this conversation along some of these books because we've got nothing very topical to discuss, but I think we have a situation to discuss. First of all, Anthony, thank you for joining me. And when you hear turning points in history, what comes into your head?
Well, I was born in 1954 and grew up in the Gold Coast as it became Ghana. So I guess decolonisation is one of the historical turning points that I lived through. I mean, I was only 3 when at independence, but I was there, and my father was in the first parliament in Ghana and was involved in the independence movement. So that's definitely one that comes to mind. As far as my own business, philosophy goes, I guess for me, the most exciting transition in history, it took a while, was really the rise, for the first time in a very complex society, of the idea that everybody mattered. The idea that the sort of democratic idea that the state and society should be organized in the equal interests of everybody. And that's such a basic thought now, but historically the philosophers tended to think that there was somebody in charge, and it might be, as St. Thomas Aquinas would have said, that the ruler had the community in his care, so that he should be looking after the community, but they wouldn't have thought that it was up to the community to decide who the ruler should be, or to play a role in deciding what should happen. And that's an example, I think, of a change. It obviously has kind of, as it were, material conditions, but I think it was a change that was led by ideas.
I want to come back to that in a moment because I want to ask you whether you feel that this idea is collapsing at the moment around us. But before we come to that, let's pursue this, because you're already answering the question that I like to ask a lot of my guests, because, well, the kind of science you do, the kind of mental endeavor you do is always and inevitably intertwined with biographical motives. So what brought you to work on the things you have worked on? A philosophical oeuvre very much centered around ideas of identity and belonging.
I think there's a pretty straightforward biographical story, which is that I was born in London, raised in Ghana, went to university back in England at Cambridge. And then my first paying job after I got my PhD was in the United States, which I went to for the first time as a graduate student, so I had never been to the United States as a child. And when I first went, I wasn't all that... I was persuaded to come by a very good friend who was teaching at Yale, but I don't know that I was extremely enthusiastic about coming to the United States because my father was a Pan-Africanist and had been an ambassador, not an ambassador, but a delegate to the United Nations, and spent time in New York. We grew up with an awareness of the American Civil Rights Movement and of James Baldwin and Richard Wright on the intellectual side, and Malcolm X and Dr. Martin Luther King on the activist side, though they were both also intellectuals. And so I did think of the United States as, in some ways, more racist than anywhere I'd ever been.
Is that still true, you think?
No, I don't think so. I think... again, this is, as it were, mere biography, but I think my unawareness of racism in England was connected with the fact that my English half of my family, my mother's family, were very elite people. My grandfather was the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the first Labour government after the war. His father was the first Labour leader of the House of Lords. Two of my great-great-great-great-grandfathers were in Parliament for the Great Reform Bill of 1832 and so on. And so we were very protected by class from any possible... I mean, if anybody had tried to look down on us, I'm afraid we would have thought that was ridiculous. And this is one of the ways in which things like race and class interact.
And one can almost erase the other.
My attitudes in the United States, though moderately well informed, because everybody in the world knows something about America, was not really based on what Simone de Beauvoir would call lived experience. So anyway, I came as a graduate student, and I needed to make some money, so I taught a course of Pan-Africanism, about which I didn't know very much, but my father had been at the 1945 Pan-African Congress and knew Du Bois and some of the key figures of that movement. So Richard Wright visited us when we were children. So I remember, so I thought that, well, this is something I could probably learn up pretty quickly because I have some of the background, and I needed to teach a course on something. Well, that experience sort of shifted my intellectual focus, because I was writing at that point a doctoral dissertation, which was about something called probabilistic semantics, which I won't try and explain, and extremely interesting to me. I'm still interested in such things, but it was very much a kind of technical, analytic philosophy.
Very much a Cambridge sort of analytic philosophy idea.
Very, very Cambridge subject. In fact, the people I read, Ian Hacking, Hugh Mellor, Richard Braithwaite, were all actually professors at Cambridge.
But almost the opposite of politics.
The opposite of politics. Now I would say that the philosophy of language has been too unpolitical, that the way language and power work together is an important topic in the philosophy of language, and the kind of philosophy of language I didn't say much about that, if anything. But so it gave me another set of interests, and I wrote, while I was teaching this course and so on, I wrote a fellowship dissertation, and I got a research fellowship at Cambridge, which was going to give me somewhere to operate for the next 3 years, and that's so I went back and did that. But at the sort of 2 years into that, I suppose because of something I'd done while I was there, Yale created a job for somebody in philosophy and African American studies at the intersection of philosophy and thinking about things like Pan-Africanism and race. And so I think I got the first job in the world at that intersection. And the joy of that was there was nothing that I had to do. I mean, if you're there when a field starts, you get to decide what the field is. I mean, as long as you're moderately responsible about paying attention to the obvious things. And so my first year as a paid teacher, I had to think, what shall I teach in this intersection? And it seemed to me there was one, I could teach the Pan-Africanism stuff, but the other obvious thing was that if you are going to think about race in America and in the world, there are philosophical things to be said about race, about the social ontology of race. What are races, if anything? Are they real? Are they unreal? Are they social? Are they biological? Those are classic philosophical style questions. And then on the normative side, obviously one of the central questions in that field is, what is racism and why is it wrong? And it turns out that, again, there was surprisingly little by philosophers on those questions. I think that's in part because American philosophers would mostly have assumed by the time I came along that racism was so obviously wrong that it wasn't an interesting question to explain why. But actually it is an interesting question. I've just spent the last 5 or 6 lectures in my course exploring philosophical theories of racism, and that sort of modern literature in my part of philosophy, I'm afraid, begins with papers by me. So, one useful thing about this is I can teach my students that philosophers change their minds, because I am in accord with many of the criticisms of the things I said when I was starting out, and I don't hold the views that I held at the start. So that gets me to thinking about race and racism, and philosophers like to generalize, so that at the heart there is one kind of social identity and one kind of what you might call allophobia, a dislike of others. But that means you can think more generally than about race. You can think about nationality. You can think about gender and sexual orientation and gender identity. You can think about religious identities. You can think about cultural identities, which, I mean, like Jewish and Muslim, which are partly religious but also cultural identities, or Western as an identity, or Third World as an identity. I mean, there are all these identities. And when I first started thinking in this very general way, the thing that struck me pretty quickly was that this was an entirely new topic, because that word identity only came to be used in that way, it's obviously an old word, in the 1950s, basically. If you look into social theory in the 1930s in English and you type in identity in a Google search, you don't get anything except the use of identity to mean sameness and so on. So this idea of a social identity, which we now take entirely for granted, is actually quite modern.
Do you think it would have been understood as class before, purely, or even estate?
Estate, standing. I mean, there are all these. Yeah, no, it's not that they were there. Class was there, race was there, nationality was there, religion was there, Western was there. It's just that nobody thought they were things of the same kind.
Now, as you're teaching a course on it, let me just run an idea past you, which interested me when I worked on my last book, Subjugate the Earth, which was because I've got something on racism there, and I follow the idea, or float the idea, that slavery wasn't a result of racism, but it was the other way around.
Yes.
That in European thought, in enlightened thought, there are some outright racists, but there's a lot of people like the French enlighteners who are basically equating the quality of a person, to use this term, with the degree of civilization as they would see it. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't matter which color these people have. If they live in big cities and they have high art, then they are to be esteemed highly. And if they live in hovels, then they are barely different from animals.
Yes. I mean, I think that's completely right. I mean, you've just, you meaning in the German-speaking lands, this is not Austria but Berlin, just renamed Mohrenstrasse in Berlin Anton Wilhelm Amu Strasse. And Anton Wilhelm Amu came from where I grew up, came from West Africa, from what's now Ghana, and became a professor of philosophy. And what's amazing, the part of the story that a lot of people don't know, he seems to have been given as a gift to his patron, and his brother was a slave in Suriname. So these two people from the same family were, as it were, given the full range of experiences that Africans could have in interactions with Europe, from bottom to top. And the one at the top, you know, he knew Leibniz, because Leibniz was his patron's librarian. It was very, you know, he was successful. And I'm working on an edition of one of his books. He's a very interesting philosopher.
If you remember, some 15 years ago, you wrote an essay for a catalogue of an exhibition I did about another African in Europe, who equally, I mean, his story is a very ambivalent one, because in a way, you know, he rose to the heights of society, but was then cast back as a savage in a museum.
I think the big point you're making does seem to be now pretty well established by historical research, which is that the early approaches to Africa of Europeans, somebody's just written, a man called Harpham has just written a really good book, which will be coming out soon, about England. If you just look at the maps they drew maps which made Africa look like a fantastical place with these amazing cities and so on. And they did not come with a negative prejudgment. And it's hard to think that of any serious explanation for the later attitudes, except that those later attitudes were necessary in order to live with the realities of what they were doing to Africans when in the 17th century 250,000 Africans were taken to the New World by British ships.
I mean, I think there's a very interesting thing here about the need of hypocrisy that is inbuilt in this Western emancipatory project. Because the Romans and the Greeks didn't have a problem with slavery. There's this wonderful bit in the Odyssey where Odysseus complains and says, I don't know why the gods are still after me, because I'm a decent sort of person. We recently raided a city, and of course we killed all the men and raped all the women, and I didn't take more than any of my companions. And, that's this idea of decency, but it shows you that, slavery or violence were not a problem in this ethical world. They are in a Christian ethical world. And there you have to create distinctions to keep justifying that.
Yes. And this, of course, you rightly made a connection between attitudes to Africans and attitudes to the lower orders, to people at the bottom of society in Europe. Again, anyone who was a thoughtful person who paid attention to the conditions of those people and contrasted them with the conditions of the people at the top, I think in a Christian society had to ask themselves, what story could possibly justify this? And so, in the realm of race and in the realm of class, theories are invented to justify, to rationalize this.
I mean, it's wonderful to read the racist diatribes of Victorian gentlemen who describe a different race of people who are so degenerate and so animal-like, and who will steal and lie and beg and murder if they can, and they're not useful for anything at all. And what he describes are the Irish immigrants in the slums of London. So race could be a very variable concept at the time still. I'm asking you all this also, of course, because of the moment in time we're living in, where identities are being redrawn. They're being redrawn in the political, on the political map, and we're talking about turning points in history, and I keep arguing that we're living at the biggest one at the moment. Do you feel that? I mean, you have devoted so much of your life's thinking project to this idea of multiple identities. You have written very elegantly about cosmopolitanism. That surely is a concept that has become seriously endangered where you are sitting at the moment.
I thought all along, when I started thinking professionally, as it were, about cosmopolitanism, I've thought all along that a cosmopolitan attitude was always, as it were, a taste, and that not everybody had it. I've never believed that everybody would easily and naturally become cosmopolitan. I spent a fair amount of my childhood in a small village in England where my mother and grandfather and my mother was born there, my uncle farmed there, but it was a village you could walk across in 10 minutes, and it's still there. And, I understand the attraction of small places. I understand the attraction of being able to take my great-nephews and nieces to see the place where my grandparents are buried in England, or my parents in Ghana for that matter, and to be able to tell a story about how within 20 miles my grandfather's ancestors have lived since the 12th century. And I can show you a map of their names, and I can tell you all the places around there where they lived. I understand the attachment of the place, and my father, who came from a small, his ancestral village is also a very small place, and I have a chieftaincy from there, which they gave me, which is named for an 18th century Asante general. And again, I have a sense, because my father brought us up with stories of all this, which is sort of normal in Asante. People tell their children their ancestry. So I don't have any difficulty in understanding that sense of place. And part of the reason I say it's a taste is because I had neighbors growing up, some of whom still live within a mile of that street, and one of whom is the first Ghanaian to be a Japanese citizen. I mean, and one of them is Spanish now. And some live in London and New York. So the family, within a family, different histories and different tastes can lead people either to want to engage with people who are different from where they came from or not. Now, that's all perfectly, I've always understood that. And I always thought what was needed was enough of the cosmopolitans to make the modern world work. That we need the non-cosmopolitans need the cosmopolitans, because for the world to work, we need conversation and exchange between all the different places. And one of the points about a cosmopolitan, as I conceive of it, is that a cosmopolitan who thinks there's something valuable in where they came from, which they want to put in conversation with the valuable things from elsewhere. So the idea that cosmopolitans are rootless seems to me the opposite of the truth. The cosmopolitan thinks that it's worth paying attention to a variety of cultures because she knows that she has something to give that comes from where she comes from. So now we have a discourse in which everybody from Barack Obama to Donald Trump criticizes the cosmopolitans. And I think that's because, as is often the case when people criticize movements and styles of thought, they just don't understand what it's about. They equate interest in others with hatred of self, or lack of interest in self. The very thing that makes the cosmopolitan, made my mother have as one of her favorite poets, a 17th century Japanese poet called Basho, who everybody knows because they know about haiku. That very thing made her curious about our neighbors as well. And an interest in people who aren't like you along all the dimensions of identity will make you want to be in conversation across class within your own society, as well as across societies. And you'll want to... You'll be, this weekend, I was baptized a Methodist, raised an Anglican. This weekend we will have a Seder, because it's Passover in our house, and my in-laws will come. And I love that. I've been doing Seders now for nearly 40 years. So that sense of the value of the human value of other humans is something that I find so attractive that I don't really know how to explain to people who don't get it, but I know there are some who don't get it.
At the same time, I think you could also argue this cosmopolitanism is an extended model of something that is true for a lot of people, or for everyone, namely multiple identities. And the fact that an awareness of this multiplicity completely changes our perspective on otherness, on the order of the world in groups and tribes. Unfortunately, the ordering of the world in tribes seems to be coming back, and that in the context not only of an election of Trump, but I would think a much wider phenomenon. A much wider phenomenon that you can see also in Europe, that you can see in the whole so-called West. I recently listened to an interview by a Russian journalist, I've already mentioned this on this podcast, who said that what they're talking about in Moscow now is what's happening to the West at the moment is what's happened to the Soviet Union in '89. Namely that people stop believing the ideology that underpinned the state, and they turn to cynicism instead. And I thought, wow, no, I hadn't made this connection, but it rings uncomfortably true. It is uncomfortably plausible that the ideology that underpinned the West, namely a liberal conviction of human equality, of the desirability of freedom, is something that people no longer automatically buy into.
Good. I think that's right. And just let's add in one other. I mean, India, which is now the largest country in the world, is consumed with a very untraditional form of Hinduism that is massively intolerant in a way that much traditional Hinduism wasn't. So this is a phenomenon of modern Hinduism. This is not an Indian phenomenon. This is an invention. And I think if you think about, so having added India in, let's use India as an example to think about it. I think one of the things that produces this is the same thing that has produced it in Russia and in Europe and here, which is a kind of failure of elites. In other words, it's a disaffection, not so much from the state as from the people that most people think of as being in charge.
A failure of the cosmopolitan.
A failure of the cosmopolitans, but also maybe a failure of the liberals because they talk a good game about equality, but they've allowed economic inequality to persist in a world of plenty.
Also to mushroom, to be quite clear. I mean, up to the 1980s, there was, in the United States, for instance, a participation of the workforce in the economic growth and in the growing profits since the 1980s. That has flattened out, but the profits have gone further up, and it has no longer reached most of the population.
Right. And this is it's a challenge which is going to get worse with AI. There was a period when the sort of standard functioning of the capitalist economy was producing increasing returns for everybody. Everybody was moving up. I think this is a part of the story of why the politics of identity shifted from class in the 1960s to gender and race and some nationality type things. It's because the politics of class in the middle of the 20th century after the Second World War worked. If you think about, it's amazing to me to read what it was like to live in the East End of London in 1950, if you were an ordinary person. And I picked the East End because Marx said it was the largest working class neighborhood in Europe. And as far as I know, it still was in the 1950s. No indoor toilets, no fridges, no telephones. Only in 1945 did the school leaving age in England reach 17. Tiny part of the population went to university. No people from the East End going to university was an amazing thing, which was what you could write about in the newspapers. And over that, and I take some family pride in this because, as I say, my grandfather was the Minister of Finance in the government that really put the welfare state into place in England. And his aunt, Beatrice Webb, one of the founders of the London School of Economics, was part of the Fabian movement that generated the intellectual basis for all this. So I feel, as it were, the Labour Party for me was a family project. But that worked for a while.
And then people get bored.
Yes, and also, if you're struggling to have indoor toilets, it's one thing. If you're struggling to have access to university, that's a different kind of struggle.
But also, if you have a Bretton Woods system, then capital will be reinvested where it's made. If you give that up, you will have mushrooming financial markets and people with money in tax paradises that are of no use to the economy where it's generated. So obviously there was also in it these legal changes. I think they were huge as well in creating this new world.
No, there are lots of things happened, and people didn't pay sufficient attention. Though actually, the person who wrote most interestingly about the East End in the 1950s was the man who wrote the book which invented the word meritocracy. And he predicted that the rise of post-war meritocracy would produce a self-satisfied upper class that would think, hey, we earned this. We don't owe anybody anything. He said that in the 1950s, and then he and he was saying it again in 2000, just before he died, and it came true. And so I was going to say that people weren't paying attention, but it's worse than that, because the possibility that things would go wrong in these ways was actually seen by some people and pointed out, and articles were written about it in The Guardian as it was happening. And that is a failure. I mean, it's a failure of the universities to not just they thought about these things in the universities, but they didn't really teach them.
But also they failed to find talking about them or thinking about them very important. I mean, my wife comes from New Zealand, and this is a small country in which ideological and political change can very quickly be turned into reality. And, she grew up in a little town of, well, not a little town, a substantial town of 400,000 people. And at the university, there was an engineering department, and there was a farming department, but there was also a department of French and a department of philosophy, and that's what she studied there. Those departments are closed now. The university, the library is no longer there. You can just do engineering and agricultural technology there. The humanities are losing their footing. They're no longer regarded as relevant to the conversation, and at the moment in the United States, you've got a vast attack on the universities and especially on the humanities.
What's interesting about Mr. Trump is that he's attacking the sciences as well. The conservative attack on the universities was originally mounted as an attack on the humanities, but one of our great science universities, Cornell, was just told that they were going to lose $1 billion in federal funding this year.
I mean, that seems to be the most suicidal policy.
I mean, it's a devil's pact, right? If private universities tie themselves too much to the state, then it's just overwhelmingly tempting for politicians to come in and tell you what to do. And in a way, it's amazing that hasn't happened so much previously. But yes, so this attack on the humanities is really an attack on, I think, on the function of the university that you're talking about, which is the function of the university to prepare people to be free citizens, to think about their own lives, to make judgments about how they want to live that are informed by the best thinking and by literature and the arts. And that picture of a liberal education is, it's very American, historically. I mean, we've had the other kind of technical education.
Isn't it a precondition for any kind of democracy?
Well, I think so. Well, I'd say this. It's a bit more, I should be careful about this because I think it's important to get this right. That whatever you need in the way of intellectual preparation for life in a democracy should be made available to all citizens who don't have serious mental disabilities which preclude them from doing it. And if you're only going to send half the population to university, then your high schools have to do that job, at least to some degree. But one of the challenges in facing a population of people who haven't been to college and who think that the people who've been to college have let them down is to combine two thoughts, both of which I believe are deeply true. One is, if you had been to university, you would have gained something valuable, your life would have been improved by it, and you are entitled to the same equal respect as every citizen. The fact that I think you could have been better off if you'd had what I had the privilege of having doesn't mean that I'm entitled to lord it over you. I am not your Herr, and you are not my Knecht. But it's difficult to because when I'm defending liberal education, people say, "Well, I didn't have that, and you think I'm worthless." No, of course I don't think you're worthless, but it seems to be just incoherent to defend the university unless you believe, as a site of liberal education. I mean, liberal education means education for free people, and the liberal arts are the arts that are preparation for freedom, and that's an old idea. I mean, Cicero talks about that.
But it's not only an old idea, it now seems to be hopelessly out of date. and not in the heads of any policymakers at the moment, or not even, of the public discourse, where I wonder, I've had an interesting conversation in this series with Musa Al-Gharbi about elite overproduction, which I find an interesting idea. That at the university, formal competence is no longer enough to secure a job, but you need a political edge. And that the function of wokeness and of the ideologization of academe was also to provide that political edge. I think that's an interesting thing to consider.
By all of that, but I would, but to think of it as an overproduction
for the professional environment that's there.
Yes, of course, there. Yes, but it's not an overproduction. You shouldn't think of it as an overproduction tout court, because it's created people whose lives, I think, generally speaking, are better than they would have been without it.
Not if you're a postdoc in search of a professorship and you're not getting any.
Yes. No, what the right rate is of, if we were distributing our wealth in ways that reflected this line of thinking, we would be enlarging and enriching the universities, not reducing and diminishing them. And those postdocs, even if they weren't going to be professors, could be working on in public education programs, because I think one thing our universities, I don't know enough about the universities in Austria to say, but don't do enough of is public education. We have public lectures and people can come to them, but we don't really do enough, I think, of saying to people, look, there's this, we're living in a world in which genomics is important. We have people who are terrifically important thinkers about genomics, and also they can explain it. So if you want to come and learn about what's going on in the Human Genome Project, come to us. If you want to know how we're rethinking the intellectual origins of racism or slavery, we have great people who can do that, and so on. So we could do more of that. And in a way, I think, I said my first sort of proper job was at Yale, but my first actual job, the first time I actually got a salary, was when I was 21 and I was teaching at the University of Ghana. And I remember thinking, because I just finished my undergraduate degree and I was going home to Ghana and I wasn't sure what I wanted to do next, so I went to the university and said, I have a degree in philosophy, do you need any teaching assistants? And fortunately they said yes. At that point, there were 2 philosophy departments in the country, and I was in one of them. So if you wanted to study philosophy in Ghana, there were going to be, in any year, probably 20 people graduating with a philosophy degree, despite which 3 or 4 of the most important African philosophers of the 20th century came from that place. But anyway, I remember thinking, looking at the relations between the students and the staff, not the academic staff, but the people who made the institution run, that there was a huge kind of class cleft there, because it didn't matter what class the students came from. They were being offered a very rare opportunity, and they were being, essentially, if they finished the course, they were guaranteed a pretty prosperous life at that point. And of course, the people who mowed the lawns and kept the streets clean and cooked the meals for them didn't really know what they were doing and didn't understand why they were being given free, at great expense to the government, this astonishing opportunity. That university wasn't doing one of the things that universities need to do, which was talking to the society around it about why we're here and what we're doing. And now I'm not, as it were, blaming them, because I don't think many universities have done that in the history of universities. But we should be. And we should be defending this idea of humane learning, not because it gets you a higher salary, though it may in some circumstances, but because it'll make you your life will be enriched by it, and making a society which enriches the lives of its citizens is surely the only reasonable aim. But that has to be done in the context of the other liberal thought, which is that people are in charge of their own lives, and so you have to decide whether it makes your life better. We don't tell you it makes your life better, and we don't tell you that you have to be this or that or the other. You don't have to be a novelist, you don't have to be a poet, you don't have to be a scientist. You get to decide all those things, but you do it with tools that we think make you enrich your capacity to do that.
Are they in charge of their lives, or do they have to be put in charge of their lives?
I think one of the elite failures is that people don't feel in charge of their lives. And it's sort of axiomatic for me that if you don't feel you're in charge of your life, you're not in charge of your life. I mean, part of being in charge of your life is feeling agency. So if you don't feel agency, you haven't got it in the right sense. Again, there's a whole spectrum here. Obviously, the typical American high school graduate is freer than many people in, say, Ghana, who leave high school in terms of options. But the sense that the one thing, as a philosopher would say, the only thing we're all doing is making a human life. And each of us is making a different human life with different resources. Among them are different identities. If you go through the list of things that reasonably can count as important identities, you pretty soon come to a number such that if you allow people to combine them in any way, there's more than enough for 9 billion people to be different in their identities.
And also to, funnily enough, find very unexpected things in common.
Yes, and in common two ways.
Yes, you can be Chinese or Aboriginal and Christian or Muslim, but you may also both be gay. And
yes.
all of
yes.
a sudden there is a connection
yes.
in lived experience that if you allow enough identities to be true at the same time,
yes.
there's connectedness.
There's connectedness. And so whenever people are facing others across an identity boundary, one of the things you should say to them is you do realize that there are people on the other side with whom you share many identities too. But I think the other important thing to insist on is that we come together across identities as well as within identities. That's the cosmopolitan actually doesn't want to make all his or her links with people of the same identity. I've increasingly found myself teaching bits of Chinese philosophy in my undergraduate classes. So part of it is that they're philosophers, but part of it is that they're not like us. I mean, they're thinking about things in a way that really wasn't well developed in the West. They think more deeply about relationships than Western philosophers have until relatively recently, and so it's the difference that's valuable as well as the identity. But yes, I like to tell the story of our neighbour, my grandmother's neighbour. So when I was in England, when I was young, I lived in my grandmother's house because my parents were in Ghana. And when she got older, as people do, she moved into the cottage next door to her big house, and she sold it. And she sold it to a very, very right-wing member of the English Parliament. And so we, in our little Labour household, lived next door to this very right-wing man. And he became a great friend of ours. He was a really nice guy. He had terrible politics.
It was not Enoch Powell, I assume.
No, but he was the guy who got Enoch Powell's seat in Ulster. He was an Ulsterman. He was from Northern Ireland. So he was close. I mean, he was not... it's hard to say how to think about his... I mean, all I'll say is he treated me like a great uncle. And so if he was racist, it didn't show up in his dealings with me. But he did, on the other hand, deal with Enoch Powell, who was racist. So I don't know. But I went to my college at Cambridge because it was his college. I mean, he picked my college for me. So I grew up knowing that he taught me trout fishing. He tried to teach me boxing, but I wasn't any good at that because he had boxed for Cambridge. But my point is, I learned that you could have a valuable relationship with a person who understood you to have terrible politics and whom you understood to have terrible politics. And that was very important for me because I was, I had a subscription to the Soviet News at that point. I mean, I was very, very far left. So I think that, nowadays, I'm saying to my students sometimes, you should. It's a pity that we don't know more people of the other party, and they think, no, we couldn't possibly know the people. They're terrible monsters. They're all racist and sexist and homophobes and transphobes, and they want to destroy the economy and so on. Well, but you can't say that about someone if you haven't sat down to lunch with them. And it turns out that people can have horrible politics, or support people who have horrible politics, which I think is the bigger problem, without being horrible people. And it's always the problem in democracies that people have lives to lead, and keeping track of what the politicians are actually doing requires paying a lot of attention. And then formulating a view about whether what they're doing is right requires often quite a lot of thinking time. I mean, I am convinced that Mr. Trump's idea that trade deficits are bad and they're a sign that the other country that you're dealing with is somehow cheating, I'm convinced that that's a mistake. But I didn't figure that out by myself. I had to read economists explaining to me why that was a mistake. And so if the president says it and people who are following him don't read those economists, it's not too surprising that they think he might be right, especially if they love him for other reasons anyway. So, given that, when a democracy is going well, it doesn't really matter if the people aren't keeping a lot of track, because policies are kept within a reasonable bound by an organized elite. And part of our elite failure is that we don't offer coherent options in elections anymore. Just going to say, I mean, in a properly functioning democracy, the elites organize a reasonable menu of options and the people choose among them. We are now offered a completely incoherent set of options. There's things to be deeply objected to in the main policies of all parties. And so it's hard to know what you should do.
It's interesting to hear you speak. Elite is such, in the German-speaking world, it is a highly suspect word. I would always argue for it. I think an elite, as long as it's an open one, is a necessity. The question is just how can you sort out the politics in such a way that the elite remains open and that you can ascend in it and probably also drop out of it?
And that it's attentive to the right things, that the elite is focused on the right things in the world of the non-elite. And that I think that's one kind of failure, is just not paying attention.
But the other thing is the functioning of that elite itself. And to me, that was epitomized a few days ago when the news group scandal about bombing the Houthis came out. And in part of this text, one answer on these texts, I don't know who wrote it, was a fist bump emoji, American flag emoji, flame emoji. And I thought, fantastic. There's people deciding on orphaning children, on making women widows, on taking dozens or hundreds of lives. And maybe that is a strategic necessity. Let us assume that would be justified politically, and that was a just genuine act of national self-defense, and that was actually necessary. Doing that with 3 emojis seems obscene to me, actually. I think an action like that, there needs to be a kind of solemnity to it. There needs to be a kind of form to it. And it seems to me that when you look at a lot of elite functioning today, such as what comes out of most of the mouths of the American government, for instance, but not only the American government, then, I mean, you've written about the honor code. And there is the word code in there. And that is an idea of a form that should be obeyed to create a kind of coherence in a society. Where's that going?
when I first came to this country, which is now, whatever it is, 40 years ago, it seemed to me there were quite a lot of people in, say, the Senate who had a rather strong traditional sense of honor. They thought it was an honor to be doing what they were doing. They thought they should do it honorably. Of course, they they did all the normal things that politicians do. They didn't always tell the truth, and so on. But when they didn't tell the truth, they were a little bit ashamed.
They're embarrassed to be found out.
Embarrassed to be found out. But also, I think they might have felt, I have to do this, but I do it reluctantly. I do it against the grain of my nature. And I think one of the things about politics is sometimes you do have to do things that run against the grain of your moral nature, because your primary obligation is not to keep your soul clean, but to serve the people of your country. And if that requires a little dirt on your soul, that's a price you have to pay. But the difference, I think, between the attitude displayed in that exchange of messages and the attitude that I believe prevailed, for example, when President Obama made the same decisions. President Obama had meetings at which he authorized the bombing of people in Yemen in a way that meant that children and women and people who could possibly be held responsible for anything were at a minimum at risk, and probably some of them going to die. But he did it with a certain solemnity. And when it succeeded, he didn't bump fists with anybody. He thought, okay, that was a necessity, but I'm not going to, but it's not something to be celebrated. He didn't even really celebrate the death of Osama bin Laden. That was treated as a solemn matter, even though that was hard to do, because he did a terrible thing to our country and the world. So I think it's right that, and I don't think I'm being sort of sentimental about the past. I really do think, I think, and in a way emblematic of this was the attitude of Donald Trump to John McCain when they ran against him. I mean, John McCain was a man who came from a family that had, for 3 generations, had served the United States in the armed forces. He was a man who, because of that, when he was captured in Vietnam, they wanted to use him as a propaganda item, and he stayed in solitary confinement for months and months and months because he refused to betray his country in that way. It would have been easy for him to do. He'd have gone home. Maybe he'd have been maybe disapproved of. But it wasn't other people's disapproval that he cared about. It was his own sense that he couldn't live with himself if he did that. So, and it was actually only because another very honorable American soldier, a young lieutenant, reported things to Senator McCain, because nobody in the army would listen, that all the stuff at Abu Ghraib eventually came out, and there's appalling misbehavior of American troops in the Middle East.
But Trump's remark about McCain was, I like soldiers who don't get themselves caught.
Normally Republican presidents tend to have a lot of support in the armed services. Donald Trump does not, because they understand, the ones who care about anything, that he doesn't understand their ethos. And he's now going to do a thing that no American president has ever done before. He's going to have a 4-mile military parade on his birthday. I mean, there's nothing more monarchical, I think, than that.
Wow.
We'll see. I mean, that's being planned. It may be that there's enough revulsion that it doesn't happen. I don't know. But that's currently, the Defense Department has asked me to look into that. So that lack of any... Now, President Trump is, in my view, mentally ill in a way that the psychology of honor probably couldn't work in him.
But it's not just him. I mean, what we've learned, what we've learned to our horror, I think, is, I'm German. Of course, that we grew up with the big question, how could such an appalling thing ever happen? And the answer is by little people doing little things. And when you saw that Muslim student being picked up at Tufts University by 5 masked people in civilian clothes and bundled her into a civilian car, did they think they were doing the right thing?
I'm sure they did, because... But that's the trouble, as you say.
But what I mean, everybody only does need to be one link along the chain. And it's not just Mr. Trump going mad in the Oval Office. It's a whole chain of command clicking into action and working for him.
So, though interestingly, in the first few months in office, he's lost a lot of generals, and the head of he's lost 3 heads of the IRS already, because they don't think that what he wants to do with the tax system is they think it will undermine people's confidence that their information will be maintained private, and that's exactly how I feel, knowing that 3 heads of the IRS have resigned. So so there are people. I mean, in the classic treatment of these questions in Exit, Voice, Loyalty by at my age, I don't remember the names of people, I just remember the titles of their books, but a great economist and theorist at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, who came from Europe. I mean, one of the things, so Exit, Voice, Loyalty, one of the things he says in these circumstances is that, he doesn't use this exact language, but that what preserves civilization is the fact that some decent people stay. They have to decide whether their way to be loyal to their country is to leave, or whether the way to be loyal to their country is to stay and fight. Because I write a column for the New York Times, which people ask me ethical questions. I've had a number of people recently ask me what they think about leaving, and I must say, I try to be temperate in my column, but one of the things I say is, for me, it seems obvious that the patriotic thing to do is to stay and fight. It's to resist the creeping. It's a kind of thuggification of our society, and it's these thuggish actions like kidnapping people, and thuggish language. It's the language of schoolyard bullies, and it's the behavior of schoolyard bullies. And so the question is, and I don't really have a good answer yet. I mean, I think this is one of the central intellectual questions for social science right now, is how to understand what's going on in the minds of people who support this. Just to say about the signal thing, for example, I mean, you focused, it seemed to me, on the right thing, which is, it wasn't that this stuff, I mean, it was stupid of them to release it in this way, and they shouldn't have done it, and people should be punished if they have high security clearances if they do that kind of thing. The scandal was what they were doing, not that it came out.
No, but the sheer thuggishness of it,
yes,
as you say.
Yeah, we should remember that the president doesn't have the support of a majority of the population in the polls. He's never been, only briefly at any time has he been much above 50%. He's well below now, but he is still supported strongly by a core of supporters, and understanding them is an interesting challenge. I mean, I don't know what they know. So, for example, one of the first things he did, which was to demolish our overseas aid system, that's predictably going to cause the deaths of hundreds of thousands of human beings in Africa in particular. Now, I know that because David Remnick of The New Yorker had a conversation with Atul Gawande, who was number 2 there until January, who's a very distinguished, he's a New Yorker writer, he's a professor of public health at Harvard, he's a distinguished surgeon and a beautiful writer, as it happens, explaining this. So I know this. It seems to me that should be, that's a headline in a civilized society.
It should be a headline in a civilized society. I had another guest on this series, Olivier Roy. I don't know whether you know him. The crisis of culture we talked about. And in this book, he makes a very simple point that I want to see your thinking about. Basically, in French, it's much more eloquently called l'aplatissement du monde, the flattening of the world. And this idea that with globalization, with technological change, and I think its acceleration, which is a huge factor in our societies, with digitization, he says that the implicit knowledge of culture drains away out of societies and becomes replaced by explicit norms. And I found for myself an image that works very well. Look at any photo of a traffic crossing, say in London 1900, and you see people all wearing identical clothes, but you don't see a traffic sign anywhere. And then look at the same crossing today, and everybody wears whatever they want because they're free, which means they're all wearing the uniform of their peer groups. But they're constantly being shouted at by signage everywhere, telling them their every step. Is that, do you think, a working image of what has changed in our societies?
Well, it's always been true that when people from different societies met, they had a thinner basis of background to operate with. And what the Romans called jus gentium, the law of nations, was for large parts of the European and Mediterranean worlds a thin but quite powerful body of custom, unenforced by anybody except by Zeus as the enforcer of norms, unenforced by any human institution, and it made possible a rich and vibrant trade system in the Mediterranean, for example, and all along the Silk Road, without, with nobody, no superordinate organization managing it all. So that depended upon norms that were roughly shared and enforced.
Things like hospitality.
Norms of hospitality, yes. I mean, Zeus is the god of hospitality and the god of guests. So the highest god is the god of guests. Yes. So I think that... and it's great if you can run things that way. The formalization of these things, in a way, is a sign that you can't do it another way. And we live now enmeshed in millions of regulations. There's no human being who knows all the details of the United States tax code. Even the best trained accountants are going to have to look up the rules for all sorts of things. Your entitlement to social welfare payments, the book of rules on that is monstrously large, and a normal person needs a professional assistant in order to relate to it. And that's driven, of course, in part by the idea that we should treat everybody equally. And the only way to do that is to say how you're treating people. And then every thing that you might do for them, there has to be a rule about how you do it, because otherwise somebody will reasonably complain that they're not being treated treated fairly. So, and yet, within families we have notions of fairness too, but they're not policed, and they're not explicit, and they work perfectly well. I mean, I don't mean they work without disagreements and arguments, but that's how that sphere of life is regulated. And it can apply in larger institutions. The norms of a philosophy department or of a university are not mostly written down anywhere. But the thing works only because people do the things that everybody expects everybody to do. If we just did the things we were required by our contracts to do, most institutions would fall apart.
I mean, that also applies to democracies. One sentence that I keep quoting is by a German constitutional judge in the 60s, who said that a secular liberal democracy rests on assumptions that can't guarantee itself.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that these assumptions are draining away.
Yes, well, I mean, our president now doesn't understand the background of norms that make the Constitution functional and the laws functional. I learned this because in the turn of the 70s, my father, who was then president of the Bar Association in Ghana, had to take the government to court because they were not respecting some important elements of the Constitution, and he won. But the Prime Minister just said, what are you going to do? I mean, he just didn't do what the court said he should do. And then, of course, he was replaced by a coup not long afterwards. So that sense that, I mean, all the Ghanaian constitutions have been beautiful things, and they've all said the right things.
If they're not enforced.
They're not enforced because of the way societies actually work. When I was in that job, my first paying job at the University of Ghana, I was the lowest paid person on campus. So I only had 2 servants. and one weekend I came back from visiting my parents and they weren't there. And I went to my neighbor and I said, have you seen these young men? And he said, go to the police station. So I walked down to the police station and I said, I don't suppose you have I said boys, because that's how we say it in Ghanaian English. And he said, yes. And I said, what did they do? And he said, they are bad boys. And I said, well, that's not a crime, so will you give them back to me? And he said, yes. So he put them in prison for the weekend. And they came out very embarrassed. They were in their underwear because he'd taken their clothes away from them. And they were laughing in the way you do when you're embarrassed. And so he hit one of them in front of me with a stick, a swagger stick. And I was so mad that when we went home, I said to them, you know, my father's on the police council. We should do something about this. And they looked at me and they said, how long are you going to be here? And my whole faith in the idea that we had rule of law in Ghana disappeared in that one remark. They were much better social analysts than I was. They could see that the only way they could win was through patronage. They couldn't win because they were free citizens, because the law... And there are people in Ghanaian prisons even today, just because somebody's lost the paperwork and nobody important enough has figured out that they shouldn't be there. And I know this because one of the law schools sends American law students every year to try and get some of them out. So now, in a decent society, when the police force is running properly, that man who did that would be despised by his peers. His family would disavow him, and he wouldn't do it again. I mean, and how you get to that, how you get to the point where it's not just in the books, but in the routine everyday life, people treat each other as equal citizens and don't behave like thugs and take people off the street and so on, is not by changing any rules. The rules are fine. The rules are in place. It's not proper under the rules. But if you have a regime that doesn't care about the rules, or you have officials who are not acting for the regime, just acting for themselves, but don't care about the rules, then ordinary people are in danger. Now, I didn't feel threatened by this because I was the son of the president of the Bar Association and the nephew of the King of Ashanti. So I wasn't expecting anybody to do this to me. But I was sort of scandalized by that. I felt very stupid not to have noticed that before.
You understand something about your own position vis-à-vis the others and your own assumption vis-à-vis the others when in a situation like that. Anthony, last question. I mean, I'm having a good time here, but last question connects exactly to what you were saying. We have been talking about this essential ingredient, these essential shared assumptions draining away from our societies. And we see that in voting, we see that in attitudes to democracy, we see that in the openness to right-wing populism and even left-wing populism. There's a lot of indications, also attitudes towards democracy, which are plummeting. You say this is not the way to do it. What is the way to do it? How can these things, or can they at all, be meaningfully strengthened in a society that is riven by vast technological change, by change in its very makeup? Is it possible to strengthen that, or is it simply a model that belongs to a pre-digital age that will be washed aside by something that we don't yet see?
I don't know. I do not know. I mean, I hope not. I hope that we can recover in all the places where it's being undermined. We can recover a sense among the citizenry that it's important enough to do these things. I mean, I've been heartened by the fact that already within a few months of his being in office, there are demonstrations by hundreds of thousands of Americans, not properly covered, unfortunately, so I don't think everybody knows about them. But friends of mine were at a demonstration.
I must say I was surprised that there weren't demonstrations by millions of Americans, that there wasn't a general strike so far.
This is another kind of elite failure. I think that the opposition is not... well, what opposition? I mean, we don't have... Our system doesn't generate a sort of... The party out of power in the United States is not really a thing. It isn't doing things. And so I have had lots of dinners in the last few weeks with people who say, why aren't they telling us what we should be doing to resist this, right? And they should be. I mean, they should be identifying tasks for a movement to save our democracy to engage in. I don't know. And anyway, if I did know something that would work, it wouldn't do any good for me to do it. It has to be done by lots of us together. It requires parties and organization and structures. I think structures are coming together. I think people have realized that the only way to deal with all this is to build movements to defend the various bits of our system that are falling apart under this pressure. And it may be that the people who really do have some sway in our society at any time, who are basically large corporations and the very rich, will feel that what's going on is so bad that they have to put pressure. And one way of interpreting the president's decision to hold off on the tariffs is that the heads of the banks and the major corporations and the car companies and so on said to him, we're starting to lay people off if you go on with this, and it'll be bad. And Republicans are saying to him, do you really want to try to govern with a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate? Because that's the way we're going. If you lose the support of everybody, Florida is a very important state for the Republican Party. It's full of people who've retired there. If they think you're going to take away their Social Security payments, they won't support you. I mean, that's a vulgar reason for not supporting you. They should not be supporting you because you're destroying the Constitution and the Republic. But I don't think that's exaggeration. I mean, if this goes the way it's going, rule of law has already disappeared. The president is already
disregarding the courts and
disregarded court orders. Fortunately, I was slightly surprised by this. The Supreme Court did not reverse the decision of the judge who said that the president should make good efforts to get that man back from El Salvador who was taken there as a result, as the government says, of an administrative error, which would not have occurred if they'd followed the law, because there would have been an opportunity for the man to explain to somebody that they had misinterpreted his tattoo, that his tattoo was not a gang tattoo, but a tattoo celebrating his mother. And they should be, I mean, this is back to the honor thing, they should be ashamed that they've created a system in which a mistake so stupid could be made by the United States, and at such a cost to the life and well-being of a single human being endowed with the dignity that human beings have if you believe in the things that the liberal tradition believes in.
Anthony, it was an absolute pleasure and privilege to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Nice to see you.
And thank you for listening to the BlomCast, or indeed watching it. Subscribe. Tell all your enemies and even some of your friends. And I'll be back.